Hi, I'm Dr. Chris Stevens, and this is the Psychology to Live By podcast. Welcome to Psychology to Live By. Today, in our music and mental health series, I'm talking with indie singer, songwriter, and producer Emily James. Originally from New York, she now lives in Los Angeles via a stint in Nashville. In our conversation, we discussed the deplorable statistics concerning mental illness in the music industry. We discussed the factors that cause this, but also the way that music enhances mental well-being and the therapeutic benefits of a creative practice, as well as the benefits that music bestows on others. And we dive a little deeper into the creative process itself. And now I bring you Emily James. Welcome to Psychology to Live By, here today with Emily James, and we're talking about a number of things. We're talking about creativity, about mental health, about mental health in the music industry, and maybe the relationship between creativity and mental health. So there's quite a lot that we potentially could cover, but I might start with a general observation about the prevalence of mental health issues in all the countries and around the world that measure it. And it's much higher than people would assume, that about half of us at any point in our life would meet some diagnosis, and about 1 in 5 people at any point in time in most countries have a mental health issue. But in industries such as the music industry, the rates are much higher. And so I think that'll form a backdrop to our general conversation. But also, Emily, I think it sort of creates a context for why you do what you do. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. I always say that I write for myself. It's kind of my form of therapy and
Yeah.
healing and unpacking what's going on inside. And then I release the music for other people in the hopes that it provides some sort of comfort, some way of helping
Yeah.
someone to feel better, feel less alone.
Yeah.
So that's kind of
Yes.
the purpose behind what I do.
I've got a couple of thoughts about that, actually, Emily. The one is, um, yeah, there's not that much difference in a way between what you do and what I do, in the sense of people, sharing their experience and people finding out that they're not alone. We're sort of, it's a kind of normalizing
Yeah.
of, you know, uh, we're called Homo sapiens, which is like the thinking being, but
Mm.
we could equally be called Homo patiens, the feeling being,
Yeah.
and we're very we're quite an emotional species,
Mm.
and the other thought just coming out of what you said too was um, the fact that we suffer, the fact that we find life difficult, doesn't mean we've got a psychological disorder.
Mm.
That it's part of the normal range of experience. It's still hard,
Yeah.
but that I think a very important thing is that we don't over pathologize normal human suffering. Um,
Yeah.
and I think your medium is a beautiful one for that, because it wraps it, in beauty and artistic expression. Um, and But I'm interested, given the statistics in the music industry are so, well, they're really dire.
Mm.
Um, and I'm interested in your take on why that might be the case.
Yeah. I think in the music industry in particular, there's a lot of pressure that we put on ourselves, a lot of comparison, which is pretty natural to do, but also in an industry where everybody is just trying to create and yeah, the goal is to be your most authentic self and put out the music that comes from that. It's kind of strange that there is so much comparison because,
Mm,
what can be compared in that? Um, but I think also with the pressures of, um, it financial burdens, and it social media, it's like the reason that we get into it kind of gets clouded by all these other
Mm.
factors that I think can really impact our mental health.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I've obviously looked into this. I've worked in the music industry, and
Mm.
the research is pretty clear around the world that there are certain what we call psychosocial factors, and some of them you've named there. There's this sort of chronic financial insecurity. There's that comparison effect. You
Mm-hmm.
know that. And I know a big part of musicians these days that you have to be quite active on social media, and we know there's lots of dangers attached to that.
Yeah.
Um, there's staying up late at night performing, not disrupting sleep, being away from loved ones,
Mm.
the drug and alcohol culture, the mythology about the suffering artist.
Right.
So I've often said that if you wanted to, it's a very potent cocktail. And if you wanted to design an industry to make people unwell, you'd probably design music industry.
Yeah.
But it's curious because there's another line of research which suggests very strongly that there's no real relationship between creativity per se and mental illness. In fact, if anything, it's that creativity is good for mental health,
Mm.
and the good mental health helps people be more creative, right?
Yeah.
Now I know that there's plenty of people who have mental health issues
Mm.
and they've really suffered deeply, and when they come out of it, they make great art. So,
Right.
but when we look across the board, that's not the case. I'm just very interested to know what your particular journey and take on these issues of good health and creativity, mental suffering and creativity. What's your take? What's your experience?
Yeah, I think just hearing that, that the research says that, you know, creativity and mental illness are not actually, um, don't
Correlated. Yeah.
correlate. Yeah,
Yeah.
because I think there is kind of this underlying fear of if I'm happy, if I'm in love, if I'm content, like, will I still have art to create? If I'm not like lonely and sad and,
Yeah.
angsty, like, and I think, great art does come from those feelings because they
Of
are
course.
such big feelings and there's so much to analyze there and so much to unpack and so many people feel those things, so it's easy to relate to. But um, I, yeah, I think there's so much in life to be inspired by and to create um, out of. So I definitely, for myself, some of my favorite things to write about are kind of the gray area emotions or
Mm.
situations that are a little more, in between the cracks that we don't necessarily name all the time, but we still all know that feeling. So I like to kind of find those little details.
Yes, and of course people resonate to those, and
Mm.
again, that in scare quotes, there's a therapeutic connection then because people are sharing. It's like they know you and you know them. It's like a kind of sharing. Um,
Definitely.
it is interesting, isn't it, that we don't have to generate tragedies in our lives to make art. I mean, in my view, life's hard enough as it is,
Hmm.
and,
Yeah.
and bad things will happen. We don't have to
Yeah.
we don't have to add to the pile, as it were. And we all have our chances to reflect on what we learn from bad experiences, but we don't want to be multiplying them. Um, there's a little feature there in something you said when you said about the experiences that fall between the cracks.
Mm.
That's very resonant of a kind of mindfulness type approach.
Mm.
Is that have you made that sort of connection yourself?
Definitely, yeah. I think mindfulness has really impacted the way I approach creating music, my approach to life in general. I
Yeah.
think just kind of it's helped me to slow down and, um, you know, be more aware of, like we said, the details of life and the
Mm.
inner workings of what I'm feeling. Kind of, I think the more in touch I am with myself, the better the art becomes because I'm able to really be honest and go as deep as possible into what I'm feeling.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? What's buzzing in my mind is my own research into the creative process. This is
Mm,
why, one reason I love talking to artists. You know, my original doctorate was talking to writers,
mm,
similar kind of process. And for example, there's a kind of, as you called it, quietening down. Um,
mm,
is a different mental mode. Uh, it's what Heidegger, the philosopher, called meditative thinking. He wasn't thinking about meditating. He was thinking about the way one can meditate on something, can
mm,
contemplate it. And we know that there are certain brain states that correlate with that. Um, that there's a quietening, a dwelling with, and a sort of relative comfort with ambiguity. And that the longer we can sit inside that uncertainty without emotional reaction, uh, the more likely we're going to join things together that weren't joined together. So there's this sort
mm.
of mindful quietude in which things that haven't been link together and they come into consciousness. You know, in this case. So that for me is very very interesting. Um,
Yeah.
when you want to create, do you have a sort of way of going about it? Like, is there a practice that you have?
Yeah, I would say it's not always exactly the same, but
Mm.
I definitely resonate with what you were just saying because I think the most common way of how I create is kind of starting with an instrument, just kind of fiddling around, either guitar, piano,
Mm.
and I'll just kind of start mumbling out melodies and then words will eventually form and phrases. And most of the time, I don't really know what I'm talking about until kind of a full verse or chorus or section has come together.
Yes.
Um, and in that way, it feels like I'm just the vessel. It's not me
Uh-huh.
writing it. It's,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
feeling tapped into something. And whether it's, you know, um, just kind of my subconscious that of something I wasn't fully aware of, and then I'm like, oh, wow, I didn't realize I was feeling that way, but that makes a lot of sense. Or if
Yeah.
it's something else, but it is, you can feel when you kind of lock into that. And
Yeah.
it's just
That's
like nothing.
fascinating.
Yeah,
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut across you.
that's
Uh,
okay.
I'm just getting so keen here. You know, like uh, when I spoke to writers, they said exactly the same thing.
Mm,
They felt that they were some sort of conduit
yeah,
for. Now they weren't mystically minded. They weren't thinking this was being beamed into them from
right.
from some sort of aliens or a quasi spiritual thing. Um, but there was definitely this sense in which their self consciousness had receded, and they were so absorbed it was more like they're witnessing their own mental process.
Mm,
The other thing that they would say is that like your practice, you know, picking up the musical instrument, mucking around really,
yeah.
uh, that they would just write. And then for them, the really creative process was in the rewriting and the editing and,
Mm.
and seeing in what they've written an understanding or a pattern emerging. And that sounds
Yeah.
very similar to your process. Is that right?
Yeah, it does feel like you have a big block that you're just kind of chipping away and then the figure starts to form.
I think Michelangelo said something very similar about
Yeah.
sculpture.
Yeah.
that you're uncovering the sculpture
Mm,
from the marble.
yeah, it does feel like the end thing already exists and you're trying to find your way to it.
Exactly, exactly. And just even when you were talking about it, you know, you were smiling and your face relaxed, and
Mm,
um, uh, there's plenty of evidence that the creativity per se is really good for people. So, you know, as we said earlier, it not only doesn't make you unwell, it's very good for you.
mm,
Um, but but your this is all taking place within an industry, as we said, that's got real problems around
right.
mental ill health. I'm curious just to hear how you've navigated that. How do you keep yourself relatively sane?
Yeah. It's definitely, it depends on the day for sure, but I think just again coming back to intentionality of just um, deciding what is important to keep in place, being aware of, there's only so much time, so
Mm,
placing importance, trying not to go to social media just to scroll on Instagram for 15 minutes, trying to use it for its purpose and then step away from it, and being aware. I think, again, it's just being really aware of where I'm at mentally and emotionally and listening to that and saying, okay, maybe I need rest. Maybe I need to go on a walk. Maybe I need to sit at the piano for 20 minutes, just
mm.
kind of going based off of that and knowing, knowing yourself in terms of, what you were saying earlier about being away from loved ones or lack of sleep, if that's something that you need, then prioritizing. I need 8 hours of sleep every night and setting boundaries around that of after a show, I'm going to go straight to sleep and not going to, you know, um, spread myself too thin or whatever, but just creating those guidelines for yourself.
Yeah, it's very. I mean this in the most complimentary way. It's very practical.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, like there's this kind of self management awareness that you have. It's like
Hmm.
it's strategic.
Yeah.
Um, that you need to protect the instrument, as it were. It needs
Yeah.
to be in and you know I do a lot of work in cross industry, but one particular industry is with the top tier law firms. With you know these are people who their productivity is their mind, right? And
Mm.
they're under enormous pressure in terms of the work hours, etc., etc. So the ones who are best at it, they figure out the same sort of stuff. They think I've got to keep my balance, my you know my diet, my exercise, my sleep, my relationships, some sense of meaning and purpose beyond my work.
Yeah.
Um, that they have to actually start to factor that in, if
Yeah.
they want to do what they love, which in
Right.
that case is you know. So that I think that's a very important message to other artists, but also to you know people in general.
Yeah.
I know, for example, that in your industry, in the music industry, you know, when I dug into the statistics, um, and you know, as I said, they're pretty bad. They're just as bad for the non-artists. They're just as bad for the roadies and promoters and
Interesting.
event organisers. So I think it's you know the message here is not just about the artistic side.
Right.
It's about these what we call psychosocial factors.
Mm.
The psychosocial factors are really the environmental and social factors that impact on our psychology.
Mm.
And so, for example, in your industry, I think one of the most important negative psychosocial factors is financial insecurity. Um,
Yeah.
uh, and I know we were speaking earlier
Yeah.
about being a middle class musician. I think the phrase we used. Could you
Yeah.
speak to that?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a really cool place that the music industry is in this time. where there is this ability for a middle class of artists and creators where you don't have to be, selling out arenas or working a full, like either that or working a full-time job and just doing music as a hobby. Um, there are lots of people, myself included, where you're not a household name, but you're able to support yourself doing what you love and getting to create every day. So I would hope that, that the advent of that kind of creates a further positive momentum with, mental health where it can kind of come back to um, my purpose here is to create and live my life, and I'm able to pay rent and buy groceries doing that. And it doesn't have to be always about more and more and more and bigger. It can just be that, and that's enough, and being happy with that.
I think it's very important. I mean, if you think about it statistically, it's like winning the lottery, right? Like so
Yeah.
few get to that absolute pinnacle,
Yeah.
and for many of them, it's doubtful whether it's actually really good for their mental health, right?
Yeah. Like, are they happy?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And whereas you know, having a sense that I can earn a living, and that maybe I can have a family and a house, or
Yeah.
that there's nothing disrespectful, I think, about, or nothing negative about being middle class in that sense, right?
Right.
In fact, I think I see it as a part of a very long lineage
Yeah.
where music was a craft that had an accepted place amongst the other professions.
Yeah.
Um, and I think returning to that's very useful. And I think with network music, a lot of that's got to do with streaming income and setting that up as a long-term,
Definitely.
ever-growing, ever-returning stream of income. Even though each listen is a tiny amount of a penny, as they say.
Yeah.
You just get a few million pennies. You're right. And again, it's contrary to that false notion of the suffering, sort of crazy artist. This is one of a person who's fully immersed in all the complexities and beauties and difficulties of life, as the rest of us are, but with a very particular skill that you're bringing to bear.
Yeah.
I think that's a lovely thing. It's a beautiful thing,
Yeah.
and I congratulate you for it. I wish more people had that, common sense, pragmatic attitude. There's enough mystery and enough nuance and depth in the creativity part, but it needs to be surrounded by and wrapped in the psychosocial factors that support
Mm.
well-being.
Yeah.
Um, we know, for example, that when people do have mental ill health, it's really bad for their creativity,
Right.
right? Subsequently, when they're better, they can mine it
Yeah.
for really deep insights.
Yeah.
Um, and I presume in your own way you would have had those experiences, maybe relationship breakdowns or things like that, and subsequently you mine it. Is that the way you work?
Yeah. Yeah. I think I've found that when the emotions are really raw and really big, I'm not able to write about that in the moment. I need
Yeah.
to kind of process it, and then, like I said, it kind of comes out in my subconscious a little bit later, when I'm really able to. I guess it's kind of when I'm able to remove myself a bit more from it and kind of study it and analyze it rather than being so
Yeah.
engulfed in it. So,
And yes, and especially given the way you described your process earlier, which is quite a almost meditative, calm, quiet space. It's
yeah.
quite the opposite of sort of emotional tumult and,
Yeah.
and upset. But within that, you can then hold, in that crucible, as it were, you can then hold the upset and not be overwhelmed by it. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. So it's therapeutic in that way for you as well. It's a way of processing. Um,
Definitely. Yeah.
yeah,
I
and,
think
and, Yeah, go on. Sorry, you go.
I was just gonna say, yeah, I started writing when I was about 10 years old, and
Mm.
um, from then until now, songwriting has been my way of processing all of my emotions, and it just kind of gives me this sense of fulfillment that nothing else has. There's just like no match of that feeling, and I think it's also really beautiful because any creator, I mean, I think we spoke about, all humans are creative in their own ways, but
Mm.
um, I think the beauty of art is no matter what you've gone through, no matter how bad it is, you can make something good out of it because you can create art, and that's something that will last and can help other people. So, um,
Yeah, as a slightly older human than you, you know, I think back, to the difficult times of my life, and there's that old saying that if it what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But it's more like uh, when we have the life's difficulties and we process them well, I think it can make us a better person.
yeah,
It can make us more human, more resilient in a way, but also softer.
yeah,
It's
more
an, it's an,
empathetic.
yeah, more empathetic, exactly. And the beauty of that for you is you can then, as I said, mine that and translate it, and that helps other people run their own inner, again in scare quotes, their
Mm,
own inner therapeutic process by
yeah.
resonating with your journey. So, in this way, I think you are contributing to well-being
Mm.
in the world. Hopefully, in my job, I am too.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's safe to say.
Yeah, but and there's something about that, knowing that you are contributing in that way is a good in itself. There's a sort of branch of research into a thing called prosociality, which is
Mm,
basically kindness, or altruism. And we've known for a long time that if you're kind to someone or act altruistically towards them, it's very good for them.
right.
They it lowers their heart rate and blood pressure and their muscle tonus, and they feel more connected and their thinking clears and so on. But the recent research has shown something very interesting, that the same sort of raft of benefits accrues to the person who's being kind, who's being,
Mhm.
and I'm interested. I think I know the answer to this. It's a bit of a leading question, but um, I'm wondering whether that's also part of the reason that you do it. Is that I'd imagine, for example, you hear back from your fans, from the people who consume your music. Tell me about that experience. When you do
Yeah,
get that connection.
definitely. I mean, I think again the reason I create the music is like I said, it's kind of my form of therapy, but um, putting out the music, when I hear back from listeners, and get messages from people who say, this song helped me through a really difficult time in my life, and
Mm.
this song, I feel like you've written about my exact situation, and I've never, heard it said this way before, and it's really helped me. Those are the reasons that keep me going, and why I do it, because just knowing that it has helped one person, is just, you know, that's why I do it. So,
It's so interesting, because again, I think about research and just what we know from psychology, that some of the happiest people in the world are people who work in volunteer organisations.
mm,
Where it's clear that what they're doing is for altruistic purposes,
right.
and it's so contrary to the prevailing zeitgeist, the prevailing sort of somewhat narcissistic, self-oriented, that the path to happiness is self-growth and self-improvement and so on. because what I'm hearing and you're saying is that your happiness is actually largely derived from knowing that you've contributed beyond self.
Yeah.
That there is a kind of altruistic dimension to this. I think this is this might be a nice way to bring our discussion to a close in that it's a very important observation, because I think many people are looking in the wrong direction for well-being. They're looking, how do I make myself happy? It might actually be more efficient to increase the happiness quotient of others.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's so true.
All right. So on that somewhat profound note, it was lovely to meet you, and thank you for all the work you're doing. I think you're very much on the right track. We've listened to your music. It's beautiful, and I recommend other people too. And hopefully we can talk again in the future.
Would love that. Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Psychology to Live By podcast. If you'd like to know more, my website is www.drchris.life. And if you like the podcast, share it with people you like so they can like it too. And the hauntingly beautiful song you've been listening to on this podcast by Emily James is simply entitled London.